You go?
Okay, it's not showing.
Oh.
We've been having technological problems all morning, so just bear with us.
Ta-da.
Okay, so my name is Tina Wilson, and I am an assistant professor over at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, BC, which is in Canada. And the Vancouver University campus is on the traditional, ancestral, and occupied territory of the Musqueam peoples. The talk that I'm giving today is called Contracts and Questions as Social Work Infrastructure. And I think of the three papers that we're doing this morning, mine is the most overview-like. I think that's my guess. Make it a little bit smaller. So the agenda or the itinerary of what I'm going to go through, I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes. I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction to contracts and questions as they show up, at least in the North American context and particularly the Canadian context. I'm going to make a particular argument about how to enter into conversation with this provocation from SARES. I'm going to do a little bit of sort of theory breadcrumbing around a particular concept from science studies that comes from Susan Lee Starr around infrastructures, and then look at contracts and questions as social work infrastructure. And then I'll show some Canadian examples if we have time. I should actually check the time just because we are running late. Okay. We are, or at least I am, talking about four things. So there's the social contract, there's the social question, and then last year, the three of us actually put out a paper raising the environmental question for social work. Which was riffing off of the social question, which is, at least in the North American context, understood as one of the founding sort of debates or conversations that started the profession of social work. So we're riffing off of the social question to raise the environmental question for social work in a similar way. And then today with this SIG event, we are going to play around with a natural contract from SARES and riffing off of the social contract. So that's sort of the overview. So the social as a concept sort of began to emerge in the late 1700s and into the early 1800s. And this new sort of conceptual object of the social gave rise to the social sciences as that sort of third branch in the university. And it also eventually gave rise to disciplines of social administration and social work. Hey, Jolene. So this concept of the social feeds into the social contract theories, but then also feeds into the social question, which was big, at least in the North American context. So social contract theories, if you are wanting the 101 overview, if it's been a while since you paid attention to social contract theories, this is it. So social contracts, they're implicit, they're not actually signed. They come from sort of formal moral and political philosophy, and they typically theorize what counts as human nature, what counts as natural rights, what counts as reasoned individual rights, and the consent of individuals to be governed by a monarch or government in the name of something like social stability or prosperity. So they are regularly used to justify the organization of modern states. And they typically, especially if you riff off of some of the more established thinkers within social contract theory, they make a division between nature and the social, or nature and the state, where if you follow Hobbes in the sort of the classic line around nasty, Brutus, and short, nature is chaos, violence, and bad, and the state is the civilizing safety sort of piece. So that's sort of the 101 on social contracts. They have, at least again, I'm located in Canada or North America, the contracts, they are powerful sort of conceptual tools that are commonly used. So this is the slide just has Rousseau's The Social Contract from 1762. We had the sexual contract, which was a critique of the social contract from Carol Pateman in 88. SARES came out with the natural contract in 99. It was translated into English in 95. Charles W. Mills has the sort of classic, the racial contract, which again is a critique of contract theory from '97. And then more recently, we also have like folks that are coming out with sort of revisions of the social contract. And this book from 2020 is called The Spatial Contract. And it's a kind of capabilities approach to the social contract, saying that there needs to be sort of infrastructures and systems in places if folks are actually to realize their human freedom. So sort of a capabilities approach to contract theory. So they're quite common. They're quite common. So that's sort of chunk one of contracts. So chunk two is the social question. So again, this is coming from the North American context. So it's the settler colonial context, where there is lots and lots of really intense discourse around nation building and progress. And in that context, the social question was the name for a prolific range of debates about how to deal with workers' actual labor, so industrial labor, and the capacity of industrial labor to disrupt social life and make demands for things. So the social question originally was either asked as the social question or the workers' question, and this is in North America again, and it was also focused on urban social problems. Just after World War II, with the development again, North America, of the welfare state, the term or the phrase, the social question, became less common, and we started to instead make sort of debates about the welfare state itself. From the 70s onwards, with the shift to post-industrial labor and the breaking up of workers as a political bloc, and all the stuff that gets called neoliberal restructuring, the language of the social question sort of came back, but under a different vocabulary or under a different language. So we tend to, as again, North America, we tend to talk a lot about inclusion. So the social question kind of moved to the inclusion question as increasingly a transnational question, as people have maintained ties beyond the nation state. And I'm sure, at least in the North American context with COVID, there was a massive upswing in discourse of care. So it was no longer the social question. It wasn't the question of the welfare state. It was the discourse of care with COVID. So these are some of the shifts in the ways in which the social question gets asked differently in different times and places. But the big shift is from the sort of the industrial workers question to the sort of post-industrial exclusion, precarity, and exploitation. In social work, the social and the social question, the social contract, these are sort of iterations that are understood as cultural debates that founded the discipline. So just in the interest of time, I'll skip over this. But there are pieces from like Walter Lorenz, who makes the argument that social work has the mandate or the responsibility to raise the social question again and again in different times and places as things change. Okay. So that was the social contract, that was the social question, and now we have Serres and the natural contract. So Serres, a beautiful book, wonderful writer, I highly recommend. He is, in his work, in this particular book, he's problematizing the ways in which, again, French, continental, Western thought splits out the social and the natural, and he identifies humanism as a problem. He identifies extremely short-term thinking of sort of politicians and media attention spans as a problem. He's critiquing the hyper-specialization of science. So these are sort of the disciplinary divisions that are common in the university that mean that it can be more challenging to engage with certain kinds of complexity because of the specialization of academic disciplines, and particularly the sciences. He has some really beautiful writing around the problems of mastery, or the mastery of nature, and the problems of property and property law, which are very helpful, I think, especially in the North American context. And he makes the argument that humans are in a parasitic relation with the world, and that climate change and environmental disasters are a way in which the world acts as a subject. So if you push the world too far, it will push back. And in this way, the world actually acts as a subject. That's his set of arguments. And the recourse that Serres offers us is he makes the argument that we need to shift from a parasitic to a symbiotic relation with the world. He he argues to use the social contract framework and use the power of the social contract within social and political thought to argue for a similar kind of contract with the natural world. So he's riffing off the social contract to argue for a natural contract. And his argument is that law and justice work within contracts to balance inequalities within relations of force. So it's the same as the social contract. There's the nation-based law and nation-based sort of justice-based policies are ways of realizing the social contract. So he's making the same argument, but with nature. And therefore, nature needs to be granted legal subjecthood. He defines rights. He puts rights of symbiosis that are defined by reciprocity. So rather than human rights, we have rights of reciprocity. So however much nature gives man, man must give back to nature, now a legal subject. So that was your Coles notes of Sayers on the natural contract. And so this is what I do when I'm grappling with things that I don't really understand, is I chunk them out into little bite-sized nuggets. This is my strategy. So this is what we're talking about. This is sort of the map, at least from a Canadian standpoint or a North American standpoint, in terms of the kinds of ideas that are available in social work and then the kinds of challenges that the natural world or the environmental crisis is throwing up. So with the social contract, you have rights of man, you have political states, you have property law or the doctrine of discovery, which again, in the North American context is massive for the settler colonies. And you have justice as fairness. The social question was very much about progress. It was about industrial democracy and workers' rights. There's a focus on social problems and inequalities, and increasingly over time, especially in North America, it's been the social question has shifted into this question of inclusion of difference. With the paper that we put out last year around the environmental question, so riffing off the social question to pose the environmental question, rather than progress, we have accountability. Rather than workers' rights or democracy, we have repair. Ongoing inequalities, those have not gone away. But rather than the inclusion of difference, we're trying to figure out like how on earth do you include the more than human within a social work rubric. So that's kind of the shift or the challenge of these kinds of questions. And then today with the natural contract, rather than rights of man, we have subjecthood and rights of nature. Rather than political states, we have the world. And I think this, for me, actually, the most interesting thing, I think, or the most provocative thing with Sayers' work on the natural contract is that he's not actually arguing for the commons. So he's not arguing for, he's arguing against private property. He's also arguing against the commons in rather to wait, what are you looking for? So we just have a tech issue.
Sto cercando un cavo che una ragazza ha dimenticato. È un cavo che ha dimenticato in settimana una ragazza.
Yeah.
All right, guys, we'll be back in a second.
Sorry. A student forgot something here, but I don't think, non penso ci sia, non c'è nessun cavo sparso.
Non avevo visto in giro stamattina,
No,
pensavo
questo.
fosse quello.
No, okay.
Ok.
Sorry.
That's fine. Okay. Apologies for the interlude. Somebody had lost something. We're back now. Okay, where were we? Symbiosis. So rather than property law and rather than the commons, Sayers is arguing for focusing on symbiotic relation with the world. And rather than justice as fairness, for Sayers, justice is actually a question of reciprocity. Sorry, we're still trying to find a lost piece of technology in the classroom. Is that it? Thank you. Okay, we are actually solved. The problem is now solved. Okay. Yes. So complicated things as well as technological issues are ongoing. Yeah, so justice as reciprocity rather than fairness. So this is kind of the map of some of the sort of anchoring concepts that we are talking about when we are in social work, are trying to grapple in versions of social work where nature and the social and the environmental are split out. We are trying to figure out how to bring those, sort of make those connections again. Okay, so that was the 101 overview. Thank you for your patience with our technological issues as well as other technological issues. So now to actually turn to the provocation, which is this question around how do we come to an understanding with things of the world such that we could actually understand one of these, I think Serres uses the term mythicals, like these mythical contracts. So nobody signed it, nobody's ever seen it. But how can we actually come to understand ourselves in relation with the natural world in a symbiotic relation and in a relation of reciprocity? And so my particular argument that I'm going to make is actually riffing off of science studies to emphasize methods, actually. So the answer that I would give to that question is that we need to tune into the ontological politics of welfare infrastructures.
Gina,
Yeah.
can you just define what Serres meant by mythical contract?
I can't define it because he's significantly smarter than I am. Yeah. So because the social contracts, they're not real contracts. They're a debate or they're a philosophical debate. So rather than something that is actually signed by individual citizens within a given nation state, they're not real things. So they're more they're almost like a thought experiment. Or a type of ideal philosophy, rather than something that anyone actually ever agreed to. So that would be how I would understand Serres making the argument that social contract theories are a kind of mythical theory.
It has nothing to do with mysticism.
No.
Okay.
I don't believe so. Heather might know. Heather's giving me the Heather knows much more about Serres than I do. Okay. Yeah. So the argument I'm making is that we need to tune into the ontological politics of welfare infrastructures. Or to say it a little bit differently, is that if social work is to understand differently with things of the world, we need to engage with different units and methods of analysis. But there's learning work to do, I think, for those of us that have grown up in cosmologies or worldviews where there is a fairly hard distinction between the social and the natural. And so the piece that I'm suggesting is a way into learning how to think and understand differently. And it's with this work that comes from Lee Starr and colleagues from the 90s. So this is from Science Studies. She's in the sociology of science. So this is in the sort of the ballpark of like John Law, Bruno Latour, those sorts of things. So for Starr, when she was working with colleagues on this, she was trying to figure out how to account for the vast array of stuff that matters to a given site of practice, but isn't actually sort of concretely available to ethnographic practice. This is what she was trying to figure out how to grapple with. So it's a question of methods, it's a question of discipline, it's a question of the ways in which the objects and methods of a given discipline focus us in particular ways and excise all kinds of other things from our purview. And so she developed this notion of infrastructure as a way to think about all the things that matter to the local but are not readily available to sort of direct observation or particularly ethnographic place-based ethnographic work. So there's this sort of 9-point framework of embeddedness and transparency. So I'm going to do sort of a very brief 101 on infrastructures and then just show a few examples from social work. But she has this lovely quote that's up on the slide, and it's infrastructures, both relational and ecological. It means different things to different groups and is part of the balance of actions, tools, and the built environment inseparable from them. So this is the sort of the methodological tool that I think would be useful, or one way into these sort of questions of how to shift to include the natural world for those of us that are trained to ignore it. So the bolded pieces are some of her pulled from Starr's sort of 9-point framework around infrastructures. Where there's a kind of embeddedness with infrastructures where, so for the welfare state is sort of embedded within ideas about the social contract, social work is embedded within ideas about the welfare state and the social contract. So there's a kind of embeddedness of this kind of infrastructure. It's learned as part of, infrastructures are learned as part of membership. So at least in the Canadian case, if you want to be a social worker, you absolutely have to learn the code of ethics, and human rights discourse is embedded within the codes of ethics. So there's this sort of learned as part of membership. Infrastructures are embodied in standards. So you'll often see this if you get into the ethics literature, the sort of justice talk within social work, where there's a kind of recursive circularity where each framework references another framework, and then eventually you end up back where you started. So the different codes of ethics reference each other. Codes of ethics reference the international definition. The international definition references codes of ethics. Everybody's citing the UN and these kinds of things. So there's a sort of embodiment of various standards within each other. Infrastructures are built on an installed base. So there's usually some sort of precondition that shapes the sense of what's possible with infrastructure. And so for, at least in the Canadian context, for social work, there's all sorts of stuff around the welfare state, around property law, anti-discrimination law, natural resource extraction industries that are just the way of life in Canada. That it makes it more difficult to even conceptualize the nature or the environment as part of social work. So there's a kind of installed base of a way of life that shapes what's possible or shapes perceptions of what's possible. Infrastructures become visible upon breakdown. So if we think about something like the social welfare system, there's a set of assumptions around the social contract, the social question that are embedded in the welfare state in Canada. And when COVID happened, that set of assumptions was radically sort of shattered. It was seriously challenged. So there's a kind of breakdown, the infrastructure or the limits of infrastructure and the assumptions of infrastructure become more obvious upon breakdown. So there's all kinds of things around, like there was where I live in Vancouver a couple of years ago, there was a major heat dome and a ton of people died because the infrastructures that were available, the ways of life that are available were not ready for a heat dome or a major heat or a climate event. Because the existing ways of life in the where I live, you don't need air conditioning. Like there was no infrastructure or recourse for people that were literally trapped by their circumstances and couldn't actually leave. So I think it was about 600 people ended up dying for heat-related reasons. So that's sort of the visibility. The visibility of infrastructures and the limits of infrastructure becoming visible with breakdown. Infrastructures, and I think for me, at least in the social work discourse that I'm most familiar with, this last piece is really helpful for thinking, is that infrastructures can only be fixed in modular increments. There's a kind of incrementalism where nobody's the boss of infrastructure. They're so distributed within society and ways societies work that the traditional, like so what for policy, so what for education, so what for practice, like those kinds of units are so powerful in social work and in thinking about how social work can attempt to enact change in the world. Infrastructures emphasize that there is no one actor who has the power to change the world. These infrastructures are so embedded in culture and networked globally. So in the Canadian case, with COVID, the federal government instituted a one-off and temporary minimum income transfer during COVID. So this was a corrective, like this little minor corrective that didn't address the welfare state, didn't address lots of problems, but did this like little minute corrective to the infrastructure that was in place. So this is just sort of an example of how infrastructure, this particular version of infrastructure as an analytic framework orientation to practice can sort of map out complexity. And I would make the case that that this type of sort of science studies lens on what's going on is particularly important as social work grapples with the environment, partially because knowledge of both the social and the environmental or the natural are compositional. They're compositional knowledges. They're not singular knowledges. They're interdisciplinary because social work has always been interdisciplinary, but they're multiple sciences that are being put into conversation. They're social work knowledges and environmental knowledges. They sometimes get called sort of mode 2 knowledges, which means that they're sort of sponsored, they're state sponsored or government sponsored, they're interested knowledges, and they're socially distributed knowledges in the sense that typically funders of research and scientific work are asking projects to pull together multiple stakeholders and multiple interests to feed into the kind of knowledge that gets produced. So this is a kind of distributed kind of knowledge rather than the classic sort of scientific knowledge. And knowledge of the social and the environmental are always the sort of whatever the knowledge is, or the sort of the broader or the more universal kind of knowledge It always is a negotiated and situated translation in a particular site of practice. And that particular situated practice changes the knowledge and works back on the knowledge. So there's a kind of infrastructural relationship in the way that STAR works with infrastructure to the kinds of knowledge of the social and the environment as they are negotiated in the world that I think is really useful for social work engagement. Yeah. And then, yeah, I said the piece already around social work has always been a mix of multiple sort of interdisciplinary knowledges, but also popular concerns. So the way that sort of social work reacts to moral panics or whatever is in the news or crisis events and these kinds of things. So there's always a blending of whatever is sort of capturing the cultural imaginary with the kind of formal academic knowledge. Again, so there's a kind of compositional nature to knowledge. And then the last piece is, it's actually from Suzanne Moore, who's here. I actually think that the history says she's lovely if you get to meet her. But she makes this really beautiful argument that that social work activities actually provide an archive and a memory of negotiated social conflicts. So there's a way in which social work is infrastructure for cultural change. You can track cultural change and you can track infrastructure through social work activities. So this is why I'm making the argument for infrastructure. And of course, it's always when you throw your slides up, you're like, hey, look, there's a spelling mistake. So there's sort of an ontological and an infrastructural politics, just as a couple examples. Take my time. So in the case, again, located in Canada, the welfare state, the welfare state that gets valorized, the justice discourse that is very, very, very strong in North America, in particular in Canada, and equity, diversity, and inclusion, or EDI is the short form that we use in Canada. These kinds of concepts that are valorized as the solution to the social question, as it's differently understood in different times and places, they're actually founded on colonial expropriation. So there's an infrastructural politics of when we tell stories about Canada, when we tell like the multicultural exceptionalism in Canada, when we tell those kinds of stories, what get highlighted, what it doesn't, and that is a kind of infrastructural politics. And so when we hold out notions of human focused justice, it's on this sort of foundation of colonial expropriation. There's a lovely piece from Decker Spark that I keep going back to, which is that the environment is a meta problem in a discipline that is tuned into established scales of micro, meso, and macro. And so there's a need to figure out how to grapple with something as complicated, complex, and compositional as the environment. So infrastructure is one way into it. And again, speaking from the Canadian context, Indigenous sovereignty movements and Indigenous environmental movements are not the same thing as liberal inclusion or settler environmentalism. They're radically different projects, and I would certainly make the argument that there needs to be a way to hold them separately, and rather than try to conflate them into the same within social work. So infrastructural, the sort of infrastructural framework that STAR works on is really good at being like, wow, things are different for different folks. So how do they actually work within networks rather than, again, in the Canadian context, there's a sort of a desire to sort of collapse things into sort of simpler pictures, or to try to find equivalence between things. And sometimes there isn't equivalence. And in terms of infrastructural politics in the Canadian state is that the environment is not built into the jobs that are available to students. So this is sort of the sort of infrastructural drag that is a major challenge, is that what people are hired to do has nothing to do with the environment. So then folks are trying to figure out how to ask questions about the environment in established jobs that are designed to exclude it. Again, infrastructural politics. That's my time. How much time do I have? 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, almost done. I'll skip through some examples. This is, you don't have to read that, but the federal government in Canada just came out with a new quality of life framework in 2022, and it stuck environment on there for the first time. And you can't read it, but these little sections down here. The one on the left is the classic social question, social contract kind of lens, and it is the fairness and inclusion lens. And then on the other side, there's the brand new sustainability and resilience lens. So even at the federal level in Canada, notions of social well-being are increasingly beginning to, in limited ways, engage with the environment. So that's one example of how things are sort of shifting and networking together. I'll just really briefly talk about this. There's We talked about this in the paper that we put out last year, but there's in Canada, all the universities are accredited against a particular education policy, and there's 13 core learning outcomes that students have to learn about. And so there's a new one that came out, new accreditation policy that came out in 2021, but it only actually becomes enforceable as of this year. And so the learning outcome number 4 is around colonization and social work. But the piece that I actually want to emphasize from this is that that there's an emphasis on students needing to be able to have opportunities to engage with a plurality of worldviews. So it's no longer sort of monoculturalism. It's no longer a singular worldview. Students actually, so it's in, at least in the North American context, there's some challenges to the monoculturalism of university-based education. So that's the one piece that is interesting, because that is one place where nature might make it in. And 2, we have a whole paper on this one, so I won't talk about it, but for the first time in Canada, there's a learning outcome for environmental sustainability and ecological practice in Canada, which is really cool. Again, I won't go through this one particularly, but the piece that I want to emphasize on this, because it is actually quite radical. I don't know if the people who wrote this particular learning goal realized how radical it was, but they actually stuck all life forms and ecosystems in there. Like holy schmoly. So it's no longer just the human. It is actually all life forms are social work's responsibility, which is kind of jaw-dropping. Anyway, I'm not sure who wrote this or what the debates were, but I would love to have been on the fly on the wall. It's like, do you know what you just did? Because that's major. Anyway, so there's a paper on that, so I won't go into that one. The next thing that's happening in Canada is that our Code of Ethics, which is from the National Code of Ethics for Social Work, is from 2005. It's currently under revision to include what gets called the Truth and Reconciliations principles, 10 principles. So the Truth and Reconciliation was a major report, commission put out a major report in 2015 that that has become a kind of infrastructural document for negotiations between the settler governments and Indigenous sovereignty movements within Canada. So it gets called the TRC report. So it's a major document within the Canadian sort of political landscape. And so our Code of Ethics for Social Work is figuring out how to incorporate the 10 principles that came out of the TRC report. So the ones that I stuck up on the slide are the ones that are most closely related to nature or land. And so this includes treaty rights, which is land rights, includes recognition of the ongoing legacies of colonization, which includes relations between humans and land, and then supporting Indigenous connections to the land. So this is another place where nature is increasingly going to show in social work in Canada. In the larger TRC report, there's this is my maybe this will get in. It probably won't, but anyway, maybe. But in the TRC report, there's sort of multiple calls to repudiate concepts used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous lands and peoples, such as the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, which again is about land and about property law, especially in North America, because it's the justification for property law and colonization in North America. And I actually read in the paper the other day that, or the online paper, dating myself, the paper, online on the internet in the news, that the Pope has issued an apology for some of the acts that were conducted in the name of the doctrine of discovery. Last slide. So an infrastructural orientation to the problem of, for those of us in Western worldviews or worldviews where nature and social are divided out from each other, is to figure out how to begin to bridge those, or how to begin, in Sarah's terms, to engage with or understand or network with the natural world differently, such that we can understand a relation of symbiosis or reciprocity. So my case is for this concept of infrastructure, this methodological intervention around infrastructures, because it allows us to tune into the ontological politics of which aspects of realities are enacted, allows us to engage with difference and contradiction without requiring resolution, which I think for applied professional programs is especially challenging. Infrastructure, this is probably my favorite, is the sort of, it allows for scale shifting between common units of analysis. So time and place, nature and culture, the universal and the particular. And again, can help us develop an understanding of what is going on, and therefore how we want to actually intervene. So it's more of a sort of methodological attunement kind of approach is what I'm arguing for in my response to Sarah's question of how on earth do we figure out how to be in a different relation with the world. and then just the blue and the green. The blue is sort of the classic the social question kind of pieces. This is again pulled from the documents that I reviewed for social work. So there's rights, there's justice, there's anti-racism. These are all in our codes of ethics. These are all in our education policies. And then increasingly the stuff that's in green is the stuff that is sort of nudging towards the environment, which is pluralism, environment, ecosystems, all life forms, and land rights. So there is this kind of infrastructural movement that's happening in Canada right now. And I will end there because that was a lot, but that was the 101 overview. And I'm going to hit it over to